Oh, do you not understand? Okay, I guess I'll translate. I introduced myself. My name is Madisyn Beare, and I asked who here knows ASL. I also asked who here is hearing and why no one was replying to me. I'd like to begin with a thought experiment. The script is flipped. Most of the population is deaf and communicates with sign language. You bump into a stranger while in line at the bank or the store and they try to chat with you. You stop them and say that you don't understand because you don't know sign language. Instead of them communicating with you in a different way, by maybe writing their message down or typing it in their phone, they use bigger signs and they begin to get annoyed. Not only do you still not understand, but now this stranger appears to be getting aggressive with you. No one stops to help you, and no one around you speaks. When discussing the setbacks and obstacles that the deaf community faces, I've heard a lot of hearing people bring up hearing aids and cochlear implants. They say something along the lines of, why don't deaf people just use hearing aids to fix their hearing? Or why not just give a deaf kid a cochlear? These solutions aren't so simple. Johns Hopkins Medicine explains that hearing aids don't create hearing. They work by amplifying sound to accommodate the level of hearing that a person already has. They're only effective with mild to moderate hearing loss, or loss of about 26 to 70 decibels, the Reisberg Institute states. Any more than that, and a cochlear is needed. And while cochlears are a lot more technologically advanced, actually producing hearing by sending sound signals to an entirely different part of the auditory nerve, they have many drawbacks. They're expensive, invasive, and they have no guarantee of usability. Additionally, they are controversial in the deaf community. Some see these devices as assistive, giving them more opportunities in a society that won't accommodate them otherwise. Others feel that cochlears take away from their deaf identities. They're seen as devices created by hearing people for deaf people to spend upwards of $50,000 on to accommodate themselves in a society that won't do the work to include them. Our thought experiment at the beginning is the life of a deaf person. Did you know that according to Caselli and colleagues, over 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents? That is 10 out of 11 of these paint tubes on my table. Of these children, 7 in 10 have parents who do not and will not learn sign language in order to communicate with them. Of these 11 deaf children, only 4 of them will be able to communicate in sign language with a parent. A lot of people believe that signing to deaf babies hinders development, and in reality, this couldn't be further from the truth. The only difference between hearing and deaf babies is their level of auditory input. This is how we as hearing people learn language. After all, English is a verbal and auditory language. Deaf babies don't receive the same level of auditory input. So if they don't learn some form of sign language, they're deprived of language input. And this is where the setback in development comes from. Language exposure leads to proper cognitive development, which sets a child up for success or failure in their academic career, their social relationships, and even their sense of self. With sign language, these deficits don't exist. And it's important to understand that ASL is a language. It's not just a way to communicate in English with your hands. It has its own facial expressions, grammar structure, syntax, coordinated movements, everything that a spoken language has, except for spoken sound. When we talk about educational outcomes, deaf and hard of hearing students are consistently left behind compared to hearing students. Now, I say left behind rather than fall behind because the latter puts blame on deaf students. In reality, our education system is not equipped to properly teach deaf students. As a result, these students have lower rates of graduation, of reading comprehension and literacy skills, and even attainment of a secondary education. Coffin found in 2004 that nearly half of all deaf students were at a 4th grade reading level at the time of their high school graduation. It's unintellectual to assume that deaf and hard of hearing students are worse at school due to some genetic component. So let's entertain an alternative explanation that I hear often from hearing people, that deaf and hard of hearing students don't try as hard as hearing students. According to the National Deaf Children's Society, 68% of teachers are not confident in their abilities to teach deaf students. But 37% aren't even receiving support and information from professionals who are trained and qualified to teach deaf students. And while interpreters are legally required to be provided for deaf students in hearing public education, there are a few bad apples in the bunch. The documentary Autism Unveiled, in which autism essentially means discrimination on the basis of deaf identity and hearing status, features individuals whose interpreters would either not interpret even half of the course material, or who would immediately answer questions asked by the teacher for the student. This effectively puts words into the mouths of students who are fully capable of speaking for themselves. It's abusing the knowledge of a student's disability. Schick and colleagues found that about 60% of interpreters are not taught fully adequate skills for interpreting all of the educational material of a classroom. Evidence suggests that students who are learning through the use of an interpreter have a harder time learning due to the third-party channel that the information is coming from. The bottom line is not that deaf and hard of hearing students don't try as hard as hearing students. It's that the education system does not try as hard for them. Essentially, due to the lack of resources that schools provide for teachers, interpreters, and students, deaf students do not have the same level of access to course material as their hearing peers. As unfortunate as this reality is, it should come as little surprise. In 1880, ASL was banned from schools due to the belief that it hindered development, and this ban was only governmentally rectified at the end of the 20th century. There was the belief that ASL hindered development and that deaf students would be punished for using ASL in schools. They would be hit on the hands with rulers, some were forced to balance heavy textbooks until they physically couldn't anymore, and some were just sent home, further limiting their access to course material. It's not just that deaf students have less access to course material than their peers. I'm a college student, and if those of you in the audience are not college students or faculty members, I'm sure you at least remember one time when you had to go to your teacher or your professor outside of class because you could not understand a concept. You could have a conversation, and the instructor could explain the concept a little more clearly, and you could walk away knowing you had a better understanding. Not all deaf students have this ability. Interpreters are often hired by the hour, so what happens when a deaf student needs help but doesn't have access to an interpreter? What happens when a teacher or an instructor has implicit biases against deaf individuals and doesn't spend the adequate time needed for the student to understand? Autism Unveiled features a woman who struggled with barely passing grades on her English papers. She went to her teacher and asked how she could develop her writing skills, and her teacher responded with pessimism. Her teacher told her that English was too difficult of a language for her to learn, and she didn't have enough time to teach her. What if the deaf student needs tutoring? These are outlets that are essentially barred from deaf students because, once again, our hearing society does not equip itself properly to integrate deaf needs. Think about the most difficult course you have ever taken, maybe calculus or physics or chemistry. Imagine that you sit all the way at the back of the classroom and you can't hear a single word that your instructor is saying, but your friend beside you can. The entire class period is spent with your friend reiterating the concepts to you. That sounds like the most confusing way to learn, right? I wish I could end this speech with solutions that I believed would work perfectly to fix the way that the US education system consistently fails deaf students. Sure, there are options. Deaf residential schools are education institutions taught by deaf teachers for deaf students through the use of ASL. Mainstreaming is placing a student into hearing public education. They therefore learn through the use of an interpreter or some form of assisted hearing. This is the most common educational route. Finally, self-contained deaf education classrooms are classrooms within a hearing public school with a few deaf students and a teacher of the deaf who teaches for most of the day. These solutions are not without their drawbacks, though. Residential schools are often far away from students' families, and it's quite common for education institutions like universities to not fully accept the credits obtained at these institutions as adequate. Mainstreaming singles out deaf students, and this is where we see the deficits that I discussed earlier. Finally, self-contained deaf education classrooms have similar drawbacks to mainstreaming, with the addition that deaf students don't always learn the same material as their peers. It's clear that we need reform. We need to provide more teachers with resources to properly educate deaf students. We need to teach more interpreters proper skills for interpreting all of the educational material of a classroom. We need to make it more widely known that the US education system is failing a majority of deaf students. No solution will come about overnight, and no solution will be perfect. But we need change, and that has to start here with all of us. Thank you.